World War and Republican France. So we're going to start this video with foreign reactions to the revolution. In other words, what did people outside of France think about what was going on in France? And the first noted commentary came forth in 1790 by a guy named Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke was from England, and his work was called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And in this work, he defended the inherited privileges of the monarchy and the aristocracy. So in essence, he came out on the side of King Louis and the aristocracy. And so this work sparked much debate and actually included a passionate rebuttal from another writer from London. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft. And I hope I have enough room to write this all on one line because it's really long. Mary Wollstonecraft, and that's actually an F. Okay, so she put forth a blistering and widely read attack on Burke. And hers was called A Vindication on the Rights of Man, also published in 1790. So it didn't really take her very long to come up with this rebuttal. And she actually took it a step further when she published her masterpiece 2 years later, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, in which she stated that women demanded or should demand equal rights, and it advocated rigorous co-education for men and women. And she argued that this education would make women better wives and mothers, and not only that, but good citizens and economically independent. So, as far as everyone else was concerned, kings and nobles of continental Europe had first welcomed the idea of revolution in France, but soon began to feel threatened by its message. In June 1791, King Louis XVI and his wife attempted to leave France, but they were arrested and returned to Paris, which prompted Austrian and Prussian rulers to issue the Declaration of Pillnitz 2 years later. And this declaration basically said that they were willing to intervene on the behalf of King Louis and to restore him to his God-given monarchical rule. And they were hoping that this would have a sobering effect on revolutionary France, hopefully without causing war, but they badly mistaken the revolutionary spirit in France. The outbreak of war. So the new representatives in the Legislative Assembly, and this was the lawmaking body from October 1st, 1791 to September 20th, 1792. This is the years of the French Revolution. Again, they were the lawmaking body. Well, these new representatives entered a patriotic fury against this declaration of Pillnitz, in which Austrian and Prussian rulers threatened to enter the scene on the side of King Louis. And so, disregarding all warnings, they declared war on Francis II, the Habsburg monarch, in April 1792. Prussian forces joined Austria against France, who broke and fled at the first military encounter. So the assembly at this point declared that the country was in danger, and volunteers rallied to the capital as rumors of treason by the king and queen spread in Paris. And so when a revolutionary crowd attacked the royal palace on August 10th, 1792, the king and his family sought refuge with the nearby assembly. And instead of offering him protection, the assembly suspended the king from all of his functions, threw him in prison, and called for the election of a new national convention. So the National Convention would be the successor to the Legislative Assembly, and it would found the first republic after this insurrection in 1792. And it was decided that the deputies of this convention would be elected by all Frenchmen 25 years or older. And so this was the first French assembly that was elected by universal male suffrage without any class distinctions. So the Second Revolution. In late September 1792, this new popularly elected National Convention proclaimed that France was now a republic, and it was a nation where the people, instead of the monarch, held sovereign power. And so most of the members of the National Convention belonged to this thing called the Jacobin Club. And basically, this is a democratic club that was established in Paris in 1789, and they were the most radical, revolutionary, and ruthless of the political groups formed in the wake of the French Revolution. And there were two divisions within the Jacobin Club, and there was one called the Mountain, and this one was led by the infamous Maximilien Robespierre, and the other ones were the Girondists. And the more radical of the two was the Mountain Group. And so after the National Convention overwhelmingly convicted Louis XVI of treason, the Girondists did not wish to put the king to death. Exile him, fine him, throw him in prison, but don't put him to death. The Mountain Group, the more radical of the two, prevailed, and Louis was executed on January 21st, 1793, and he was executed on the newly invented guillotine. So both the Girondists and the Mountain were determined to continue the war on tyranny, and they were able to defeat the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy in France on September 20th, 1792. And the French army subsequently invaded Savoy, Nice, and the German Rhineland. And so by November 1792, they pretty much occupied the entire Austrian Netherlands. And everywhere they went, French armies of occupation chased the princes away, abolished feudalism, and typically found support among peasants and middle-class people. And so in requisitioning food and supplies and plundering local treasures, the French liberators began to look like foreign invaders. And so international tensions increased as the French continued in their conquest. So in February 1793, the National Convention, who at this point was already at war with Austria and Prussia, took it further and declared war on Britain, Holland, and Spain. Thus, France was at war with almost all of Europe. And so a great war in Europe would last almost without interruption until 1815, when Napoleon would finally be defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. So within France, there was turmoil as well. There were peasants in the Vendée, I'm not sure, region of Brittany who revolted because they didn't want to be drafted into the army. And then in March 1793, the National Convention was locked in a life and death political struggle, with the more radical Mountain Group accusing the Girondists of inciting sedition in the provinces. So even within the Jacobin Club, this leading revolutionary radical group, there were divisions that were causing major political strife in France. And so, not to mention the laboring poor of Paris, called the sans culottes, because they were without breeches. That's not that they were without pants. They were without the pants that the aristocrats wore. I mean, they pretty much wore pantaloons instead of the fancy silk knee breeches. And I'll spell that, or try to, because that's important. Sans culottes. Oh, wait. I think it's one L, and two T's. The sans culottes, again, they were the decisive political factor because the Mountain, sensing a chance to outmaneuver the Girondists, sided with the sans culottes, and they were able to engineer a popular uprising. So on June 2nd, 1793, The armed sans-culottes invaded the convention and forced the arrest of 29 Girondist deputies for treason. And so Robespierre, the leader of the Mountain Group, emerged as the new leader of the Committee of Public Safety, which was formed by the National Convention in 1793. And the purpose of it was just to deal with threats from within and outside of France, mostly threats of treason or people not being revolutionary enough. So moderates in leading provincial cities revolted against the committee's power and demanded a decentralized government, while counter-voluntary forces in the Vendée drove back the Republic's armies. So by July 1793, only the areas around Paris and on the eastern frontier were firmly held by the central government, and their defeat seemed imminent. So a year later, in July 1794, the revolutionary government had basically reasserted control over the French provinces, and they did that by enforcing a planned economy, instilling revolutionary terror, and a modern nationalism that would fuel this total war effort. And so Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety collaborated with the sans-culottes and established this planned economy in September 1793. And the plan was to have completely egalitarian or equal social overtones. And he set maximum prices for commodities and introduced rationing, or giving out a certain number of goods per family per week. The government told craftsmen what they could produce. They nationalized a bunch of small workshops and requisitioned raw materials and grain. And so this was essentially socialism. And this thoroughly frightened Europe's propertied classes and also influenced the development of socialist ideology. Radical economic measures supplied the poor with bread and the armies with weapons. But it was the reign of terror that solidified the home front. And they had these special revolutionary courts that were responsible only to Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety, and their primary job was to try enemies of the nation for political crimes. And in an effort to impose unity, they got rid of women's clubs. They banned women's participation in political debate. So in some ways, this was a step backwards in terms of Enlightenment ideals. But this program that was initiated by the Reign of Terror also brought the revolution into all aspects of everyday life. They had revolutionary art and revolutionary songs, and they introduced secular holidays that would hopefully replace Christian holidays. And they initiated a whole campaign of de-Christianizing France. And the aim of that was to get rid of all Catholic symbols and beliefs. They started over at year one, and they had a 10-day week instead of a 7-day week. Anything that had any type of religious influence or backing was done away with. Revolution in Saint-Domingue, and we won't go into a whole lot of detail about this, but Saint-Domingue was a French colony who had a very large slave population. And around 1791, groups of slaves began to hold nighttime meetings to plan a massive insurrection. And they actually incorporated religious rituals into this, which later became known as voodoo, which is kind of like a combination of African cults and Catholicism. And so the uprising began on August 22nd, 1791, and very quickly swept through much of the northern plain. And they created a slave army that was estimated to be about 10,000 men, and they attacked and destroyed hundreds of plantations. So on August 4th, 1792, the French National Assembly issued a decree enfranchising all free people of color, meaning they gave them the right to vote. Eventually, this went from a slave insurrection to independence. And I want to say this is the only time in history that has happened where a slave insurrection led to the independence of a nation. And this is a nation that we now know as Haiti. So the Thermidorian reaction and the Directory. The success that the French armies experienced led Robespierre and the committee to relax the emergency economic controls, but they still used the Reign of Terror to wipe out any of their critics. And so people were getting sick of this, even people who had initially been on Robespierre's side. So a group within the convention of radicals and moderates, knowing that they might be next, conspired to shut down Robespierre. And they did this on July 27, 1794. It's called a Thermidorian reaction because, according to the new months that the committee had set up, it was the 9th of Thermidor. And so this is France's new republican calendar, so that's why it's called the Thermidorian reaction. But essentially, they sent Robespierre to the guillotine because they feared that he might turn on them. And so in the Thermidorian reaction to the Reign of Terror, the respectable middle-class lawyers and the middle-class professors who had initially led the liberal revolution of 1789 reasserted their authority. And they got rid of many of the economic controls and restrictions on local political organizations. Sadly, though, the collapse of these economic controls hit the working poor really hard. And so the convention ended up having to use the army to suppress the sans-culottes protest. And so many of the urban poor just lost revolutionary fervor, and many of the countryside poor just turned toward religion as their only hope of relief from their earthly cares. And so the middle-class members of the National Convention wrote yet another constitution in 1795, where they reorganized the Legislative Assembly and chose a 5-man executive called the Directory. And so the Directory continued to support French military expansion abroad, and they were basically using war as a way to meet ever-present yet unresolved economic problems. And so the French people were growing very weary of the actions of the Directory, they constantly used the army to nullify the election of people that they didn't like. So there were a number of conservative and even monarchist deputies who didn't get their proper offices because the Directory decided that they shouldn't hold office even though they were elected. So this really paved the way for Napoleon Bonaparte. And 2 years later, Napoleon ended the Directory in a coup d'etat, or an overthrow of state, and substituted that weak dictatorship, which it pretty much was, for himself, a strong dictator. And so, in essence, the effort to establish a stable representative government did not work in France. And so we'll end there today, and we'll pick up in the next video with the Napoleonic era.